At Consumer Cellular, you get the same exact coverage as the largest carriers, but for up to half the cost. Same thing, up to half the cost. Up to half the cost for the same thing. 50% the money for 100% the same thing. I hope I'm making myself clear. Consumer Cellular. When freedom calls, we're here to answer. Call us at 1-888-FREEDOM.
Half the cost savings based on cost of Consumer Cellular single-line 5GB data plan with unlimited talk and text compared to lowest cost single-line postpaid unlimited talk, text, and data plan offered by T-Mobile and Verizon May 2023.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and him, Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Later in the show, we'll be talking to James Burrows, who's Divisional Director, Kieran, is that right?
That sounds impressive to me.
Let's go for Divisional Director of Sport at insurance brokers Howden, about feeling the strain. Their report into the cost of injuries across the top 5 European leagues at the midpoint in the season. I think they've broken a record for losing the BAFTA nomination, Kieran. Not even halfway through the intro. First, though, it's news day, and talk about feeling the strain. I have to reveal, Kieran, this is a second pod we've recorded in 2 days because you may be hearing this on Thursday, but for logistical reasons, we are recording this on Monday. So 2 hours work in 2 days, Kieran. It's a disgrace, isn't it?
Absolutely outrageous.
It is. It also means that if producer Guy makes the winning bid for Chelsea, we'll have to deal with it on Sunday, I'm afraid. Luckily, though, Kieran, this story broke just hours ago, so we can fit it in. Brighton have published their figures, and have I got this right, Kieran? They're losing £4 million a day, mainly on beard oil and that unwise investment in the couscous mine.
Well, it's not quite that bad, but £1 million a week for a club that's in the promised land of the Premier League is it's par for the course. Sadly, these days, we just keep coming out with these stories, and now it's a bit like sort of COVID news. You just become completely immune to it, and it normalises the losses. But my club brought out the results at midday, and I took a quick look, and of course, got into spreadsheet heaven on the back of that. But it's we've just lost huge sums of money. 9 years out of the last 10, significant numbers. The owner, Tony Bloom, he's put in £427 million of his own dosh into the club, which is great, as a fan. He is a fan first and foremost, rather than a businessman as far as his relationship with the club is concerned. But it does show just how difficult it is, A, to get there, and B, to stay there.
Kieran, you've talked quite often recently about owners becoming bored. Is there a fear? Because, I mean, if that was to happen with Tony Bloom at Brighton, you're in trouble.
Yeah, but are you going to stop supporting Palace? Am I going to stop supporting the Albion? Tony Bloom's been going to watch the club since he was 7. His elder brother has supported the club all his life. One of his uncles, I think, or his granddad was on the board as well. So it would be highly, highly improbable that he would lose the love of the club. He might get fed up writing out all of these checks and decide to tone it down a bit. But I don't think it would go any further than that.
Were you surprised by these figures, Kieran? Because on the face of it, some of them were all right. Wage spending was okay, wasn't it?
Of all of the clubs that have published their accounts to date, Brighton have have revealed that they've got the lowest wage bill. And we know that money talks in football, and I regularly have differences of opinion with people. I just say, we've got a bottom 6 budget. Don't expect to be outside of the bottom 6. Whereas other people seem to think that we should be trying to compete further up the table. And then you ask them, well, in which case the money's got to come from somewhere. Where exactly do you suggest? Because the owner is sticking in loads of money, and then sort of the conversation tends to change into something else, such as favourite cheese or something like that.
Well, at Brighton, of course, many conversations turn into favourite cheese, Kieran. We know that, and how best to use it in the Guinness soup. I imagine, Kieran, it's the same story at Brighton as it is at Palace and at Burnley and at Southampton and clubs of that level. It's probably generational, where fans of our age are only too aware of what can happen when you try and do what Charlton did all those years ago and break the bank rather than swim along merrily in the Premier League. Whereas fans under the age of 30 who have known more Premier League than not Premier League just get a bit bored swimming along in the middle of the Premier League, and they want the glory of Champions League football, and that comes at an almighty cost that most clubs in the Premier League can't afford, isn't it?
Yes, and you've only got you're right. It's happened to other clubs. If you think about Stoke City under Tony Pulis, they used to finish top 10 on a regular basis, but the fans, not the fans. Some fans became to get a bit fed up with that. We saw it at Bolton and Sunderland, and those clubs have had some pretty grim times since then. So. But it's nothing wrong with a fan being ambitious and being a daydreamer, but at the same time, you've got to temper that with realistic expectations. You can't beat the house at the casino, and you can't beat the house when it comes to football and wages. Leicester City did it. It's never going to happen again in our lifetime, in all probability.
Well, because the other clubs won't let it happen in the top six, basically. Yeah, we're having at Palace the daydream realism scenario at the moment. It's like we're going to Wembley. That's definitely happening. We're daydreaming about going back to win the FA Cup. That's not happening. In the meantime, you just have to enjoy what is happening, and you never know. Further down the league, Rochdale, who are a club close to our hearts at the moment, Rochdale AFC have said that no current board members or employees have been charged with breaches of EFL regulations.
Yes. A few weeks ago, the EFL put up a statement on their website to say that it was looking into concerns that it had with regard to the club, officials and relevant persons. A relevant person is normally a significant shareholder. In relation to, I think, things broadly linked to the owners and directors test. So with regards to this, as people may be aware, there was a hostile takeover attempt by an organisation called Morton House last year. And what this company did is that Rochdale's quite unique in the sense that instead of having an owner, we've just been talking about Tony Bloom, or we've got the Glazers at Manchester United, or we've got Sheikh Mansour at Manchester City. We've got you've got your guys at Palace. You've got Harris and Blitzer, and so on. Instead of having one owner, or perhaps 4 or 5 owners, the shareholdings in Rochdale are very much spread amongst a large number of people, and that's great. For those of us that are familiar with the cooperative movement which was set up in Rochdale, I think it's a fantastic throwback to sort of community or broad-based ownership. But what this company, Morton House, did was Rochdale shares. Most people just held on to them as a memento. You might have 100 shares, you might have 500 shares, passed down from generation to generation. The market value of those shares was probably no more than £2 a throw. And it looks as if Morton House went in and said, well, we'll offer you £4 or £6 or £8 for your shares. And some people said, well, it's just gathering dust. We're not doing anything with it in terms of the share certificate. And they started to sell some of their shares, and Morton House built up. They built up to around about, I think it's about 42, 43% of the club in total, with a view that once they got to 51%, they've then got control. Rochdale fans weren't comfortable with this. I think there was a meeting between one of the fan groups and the prospective owners, and I think it's fair to say things didn't go down particularly well. Rochdale fans then started to do an awful lot of homework with regards to Morton House, and the club then issued some more shares, but it didn't let Morton House buy any. So therefore, Morton House's shareholding fell from 42% I think it's now around about 27, 28. Now, in theory, when you get to a particular threshold, once you get to, I think it's 30% of a company or of an EFL football club, you are obliged to tell the EFL that this triggers a potential owners and directors test. And what appeared to be the case in relation to Rochdale was that the club didn't process, for whatever reasons, or some person at the club did not process the documents, which allowed Morton House to not only get to 30%, but they should have then immediately have had to taken the owners and directors test. That didn't apply. Why didn't that take place? We're not quite sure. So the EFL have charged the club, officials, relevant persons. And I think the intriguing thing, which Rochdale have now come out to say, is that no current. Ooh. And that is the key word, because I'm not going to name names, but if you go on to Companies House, you will see the list of people who have become directors, which is fine, but also perhaps some of the names of people who are no longer at the club. So no current board members or employees have been charged. Go down that particular crumb trail, and you might you might perhaps get an indication as to who some of the people who have been charged are.
Mm. And what are the potential ramifications of these charges for those people?
Well, the EFL in theory has an unlimited range of sanctions. Having said that, if the people involved are no longer officials of football clubs, there's not a lot the EFL can do. They could say, well, we don't particularly want you to come back to the EFL, but even so, I'm not convinced that that's the case. That they've got Peter Ridsdale on the board of the EFL, and as we've said before, he's been banned from being a director of all companies in the country for a period of many years. And as soon as his tariff came up, he bounced back. And also, to be fair, I was talking to some or a fan of Preston North End. At the gig last week at Wimbledon,
there are a couple
the live show.
They gave me a sticker.
Oh well, and they said that they're quite happy with Peter Ridsdale. So okay. I'm not saying that he's bad at his job, but to get banned from being a director of any company for 6 or 7 years, that's quite an achievement, I can assure you.
Yeah, he's not necessarily bad at this job. He can be great at this job. It doesn't mean that he hasn't been terrible at other jobs. It's not for us to say, Kieran, but we can point out he was banned for several years. So, and you're right to point out Palace do have major investors called Harris and Blitzer. And as a Millwall friend of mine at the time said, any of other of Santa's reindeer intended to take over as well. Which probably would have been funny if I'd got the right words in the correct order. Swindon Town can't take card payments for next year's season tickets because of an ongoing court battle. This is not the ongoing court battle, is it? The Gareth Barry ongoing court battle?
No. This is another one, and we again, Swindon is a team that we have generated an affection for because they went through some hard times, and this is an overhang of the Lee Power era. Lee Power was the former owner of Swindon Town. Rob Angus, who's been on the show, who's now the chief executive of Swindon Town. And I'd like to think that it was being on this podcast that got him the job. But it's probably pushing it a bit.
I think he would have mentioned it, Kieran. I think he probably would have slipped it on his CV.
Yeah. So this is a winding up order in respect of Swindon Town, and it comes from an American company called AC Sports Wiltshire. And it relates to what they considered to be, I think, some form of loan to the club, where under Lee Power's period of control, the present owners feel that that's not the case, and therefore there's no obligation to repay it, and therefore the court is going to deal with things. But in the meantime, the credit card companies, they credit check corporations, just as the way that they credit check us. Because remember, if you buy something using a credit card for more than £100, then under the Consumer Credit Act, if it is faulty, you're entitled to a refund, and if the company you're entitled to a refund if the company goes bust. Now, if they see a potential winding up order against Swindon Town, what they're concerned about is, well, what happens if things don't work out? This winding up order is significant. People have bought their season tickets using credit cards, and therefore we have to go and pay out. So therefore they've just said, we're not going to take on that risk. And risk is something which we'll be discussing, of course, with James Burrows when we do our insurance interview a bit later.
Yeah. I'm sure some of our silver-tongued friends, Kieran, as you put it, would settle this argument very quickly, but
so would Uncle Terry, to be fair.
Uncle Terry would settle many arguments very quickly. What's your favourite cheese? I'll ask Uncle Terry. He'll tell me. But obviously Swindon Town are under new ownership now, but they're the same corporation as such, aren't they? They're the same company that they were when Lee Powers was in charge. So presumably they are liable still for this outstanding court case, aren't they? The court case wasn't against Lee Powers, against Swindon Town Football Club, I presume.
Exactly. This is sometimes known as the veil of incorporation, that there's a separation of owners from the companies themselves. So although Lee Power may have instigated this arrangement with AC Sports Wiltshire, and we don't know whether it's a loan or some other form of arrangement, it is the company that's on the hook for it.
That sounds like a Cure B-side, doesn't it? The Veil of Incorporation. One of those unnecessary instrumentals that they throw in every now and again. Sounds exactly the same as everything else.
Although today is 42 years. 42 years since A Forest was released, the greatest song of all time.
Well, do you know what? Ali agrees with you on that, which is she's a huge fan of The Cure. I did try doing the sloppy lipstick and curly hair look, but it didn't go down well. It doesn't look that good on him now at the moment, I have to say. There comes a time when he's got to admit that he's older than we are, Kieran. Yes. Robbie Keane, no, sorry, why should he? He can dress and behave exactly how he wants to. Robbie Keane has been urged to pay back €500,000 to the Football Association of Ireland to help grassroots football. Pay it back from where, Kieran?
Well, Robbie Keane was in 2018 appointed as Mick McCarthy's assistant, and he's on €250,000 a year. And Mick McCarthy left his position in 2020 and was replaced by Stephen Kenny. Now, Robbie Keane isn't part of Stephen Kenny's backroom team. So since then, he has a contract which entitles him to €250,000 a year. And this is where I start to feel a bit uncomfortable. As far as I'm concerned, and again, our silver-tongued friends would agree, contracts are contracts.
Yeah.
But in steps an opportunist politician from Fine Gael. And he says that Robbie Keane has been earning income with little to show for it. I'm thinking, hold on, this is coming from a politician. Pot kettle black.
Yeah.
This is a bit of grandstanding, a bit of populism. The money should be given back to the FAI to help grassroots football. Well, if we are looking at people who have taken advantage of the FAI over the years, especially over some recent years, and I'm mentioning no names.
Yeah.
But read the book called Champagne Football if you want to look into this in a bit more depth. Then, as far as I'm concerned, Robbie Keane isn't one of those people. He's represented his country. I remember doing absolute cartwheels when Robbie Keane scored some goals at times. And he's been a fantastic player for the country, of whom have celebrated his contribution historically. So this looks like a little bit of political opportunism, using Robbie Keane as the fall guy. Well,
as we found out in the early days of the pandemic with Matt Hancock, it's very easy to use football as a diversion, isn't it? When Matt Hancock said, never mind PPE, look at all that money the footballers are earning. They should be, basically. It's what they call it. It's not literally, I was going to say, it's literally throwing a dead cat on the table, but it's not literally, is it? Although, again, Uncle Terry, I imagine, would have done that in a couple of meetings as well.
Yeah.
A cat that wasn't dead when Uncle Terry came into the meeting. City Football Group, it looked like they're acquiring another club, Kieran.
Yes, this is Dutch club NAC Breda, and the empire is growing all the time. City, I think they are aware that Brexit has caused challenges for clubs in the UK. And we know that they've got I think they own 44% of Girona. They've got investments in other places in Europe as well as other continents. And the multi-club ownership model, as far as City's owners are concerned, where you get that continuity of training, of recruitment, of data analytics, which goes throughout the whole group. I think they're starting to now see that that is generating a return, and they want to expand their empire. And Dutch football, as you and I grew up with, the gobsmackingly great Dutch teams of the mid-70s. And there still is that sort of mentality in Dutch football where for a relatively small country, it does traditionally punch above its weight because of its commitment to technique and tactics as opposed to perhaps sort of raw power. And City have said, well, let's go for this. We don't see NAC Breda as being a potential opponent for Manchester City. They're probably not going to be necessarily trying to nip in for the Champions League places, so there's no conflicts of interest there, and it can be used as either a holding area or a development area for the group as a whole.
I saw an interview with a Dutch journalist a couple of years back, which just made me laugh a lot, because he basically said if we could get some of our players to give up smoking, we'd probably win a tournament within the next 2 years. He said, but it's a tricky job. Derby County's administrators apparently spent the weekend assessing all the offers that have been made for the club. Talking to somebody in the insolvency business at our live gig, it was a rather eye-opening conversation. It makes me think that the Derby County administrators may have spent that meeting in their vest with pizza, watching Simpsons videos as well. But what will the criteria for that assessment be? And it may well be, Kieran, that as we're going out on Thursday and this is Monday, that we know who the preferred bidder is. But again, it comes back to a question I always ask, because people always ask me because they think it's the right answer. Is it always going to be the highest bidder?
The administrator's responsibility is towards the creditors of Derby County Football Club Limited. And given that those creditors are not going to get all that they've supplied to the club in good faith back, then it would, under normal circumstances, you would have to say, yes, it would be the highest bidder. But I think we then need to ensure that we look at the small print, because what exactly are people trying to buy? Is it going to be the property assets? Because remember, Derby County's stadium is not included in the package. Are the prospective bidders, are they simultaneously negotiating with Mel Morris, who has made I've not been the biggest fan of the administrators, but Mel Morris snaffling the stadium for himself has made a challenging job more challenging, because ultimately, what are you buying? So having to run things in parallel, to try to make sure we keep it, that we and this is possibly the reason why, if you take a look at what the administrators have said in their public pronouncements, they've slagged off the EFL, they've slagged off Wycombe Wanderers, they blamed COVID, they blamed Uncle Tom Cobley and all. The one person they've never said a bad word about is the person who appointed them as administrators and the person who will be approving their fees. There is this added complication. So they will have to take that into account. They will be doing some broad background work. There's no point us recommending a preferred bidder if we have evidence that this person is not going to pass the owners and directors test. So I would imagine they will be trying to make sure that they have discussions with the bidders, which, according to Simon Jordan, who I believe he was mentioned at AFC Wimbledon last week,
Yes, he was mentioned in various different emotional ways, Kieran. I refer to him as a wrong un, and you refer to him as your mate. We haven't got time to go into that now. The people who are at the gig will understand what that was. The first real curveball you've thrown me since about pod 2. So Simon Jordan. What happened if you and Simon Jordan and Tracy Crouch together? My God, what would you do then if you had Simon Jordan in one room and Tracy Crouch in another, both calling to you?
Well, Simon would be too busy looking in the mirror.
That's a fair point. That's a very fair point. Yeah.
But he seems to think that Mel Morris, because Mel Morris has guaranteed the money owed to MSD Holdings, who are the main lender to Derby County, if there isn't a decent price for the club, then Mel Morris has to make up the shortfall. So Simon Jordan suggested, and I have seen this mentioned on a few occasions before, could Mel Morris now come in and try to buy the club from the administrators? Now, I suspect that might cause a bit of bad feeling amongst all of the unsecured creditors who supplied goods to Mel Morris's Derby County in good faith and now are going to get 25 pence in the pound if they're lucky. Mike Ashley is not in it, but he's not out of it. And there was an article in the Newcastle Chronicle today from Nick DeMarco saying that, as far as he's concerned, Mike Ashley is in the hard but fair category. He's a demanding client, but at the same time, you know exactly where you are with him, and he does take advice. So, I've said that Mike Ashley would not be the worst thing to happen to Derby, because he'll get the club on an even keel, and you'll have a more sustainable club. So, Mike Ashley potentially involved. I believe there's still a local consortium. Their biggest challenge is how are they going to get the money together? And if they do get the money together, just how quickly? So, it could be that we have one party who says, I can give you £40 million next Thursday. And then you've got another party who says, well, I can give you £45 million, but it's going to take us 5 years to get the money. And that's the type of scenario that the administrators will have to go through in determining what they consider to be the best interests of the creditors.
If Mel Morris was to do that, I mean, that's going to look like it was a deliberate tactic, isn't it, really? It's going to look like that he was working with the administrators to make that happen. I think Derby fans would be most unhappy about that.
I think it's unlikely, because if he was going to do that, why not just go and do that on day one of the administration and save yourself 6 months of accountants' fees and an awful lot of cigars? Yeah,
but there is some optimism for Derby fans, though, in the fact that we are talking about bidders and offers. So it looks like the 2 or 3 people are involved, which can only be a good thing. Now, Bet365, the owners of Stoke City, have had a busy week, Kieran. First of all, they sold the stadium to themselves. Now they've converted £40 million worth of loans to Stoke City into shares. Could you just for a moment, Kieran, take off your cynical hat, which I know you rarely wear, and just shed some light into what's happening here and the timing of this?
Yeah, well, as well as writing off £40 million of loans into shares, it looks like that they've written off another £120 million of loans, full stop, which is incredibly generous on the face of it. But the alternative viewpoint is to say, are Stoke City Football Club ever going to be in a position where they can repay Bet365 £160 million? And on the basis of what we've seen in respect of Stoke City's accounts, and again, Stoke City are a club that even in the Premier League, and you thought, well, it's a decent club, solid club, no fancy dams, doesn't live beyond its means. It was still losing money in the Premier League. And Bet365, under the Coates family, who are fans of Stoke City Football Club, have been very generous benefactors. I think
to the area as well, not just to the football club. It has to be said. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think this is sort of a formal acknowledgement that, look, it's a bit like I've said sort of it's a bit like the bank of mum and dad, where I lend money to our kid. I know he's never going to repay me, and at some point in time, I'm going to say, well, that few grand I lent you to buy that car or to put down a deposit or a house or whatever it is. Let's just forget about it. Now, he knows, and I know from day one that I was going to say that at some point, but it's just at that point where he's not irritating me too much that I'll actually formally go, yeah, okay, let's just formalise this. So that's what we're seeing with Bet365. They knew when advancing that money to Stoke City that it was realistically never going to be repaid. Let's just make it formal, and it makes the accounts look better because instead of having huge losses and huge loans, they effectively are just zapped and disappear.
Right, and is the timing relevant?
I think Stoke City's accounts are almost due. There has been a lot of chatter on social media with regards to Stoke and will they fail financial fair play? And this doesn't actually make a blind bit of difference to the FFP calculations, but at least it will perhaps stop some of Stoke's critics from having a pop at them. But I don't think it's more of a convenience time than anything else.
Yeah, and let's be fair, Bet365 can afford to write off those loans, can't they?
Oh yes,
yeah.
Oh yes, yeah. They're very, very successful.
Yes, Liverpool have entered the non-fungible token market. I'm still not sure what they are, Kieran, but I do love saying fungible.
Yes. So, what are Liverpool doing? Liverpool are selling Legends cards. And they're selling them for, and we've had this discussion. It's a digital Panini card, and you don't know which one you're buying. So they're going to issue quite a few of these. The aim is to raise around about £9.5 million. They are going to be sold for $75 a pop. So you are effectively, it's a bit like a raffle or a tombola. You will be allocated one of these tokens, and it will be a cartoon picture of a Liverpool football player, and you're going to pay $75 for it. And it is authenticated via the blockchain, and this is where some people are getting a bit fed up because the blockchain it's a bit like a letter of authenticity. So I've got a football shirt signed from my club to say this is the shirt. This is the shirt worn by Paul McShane when he scored the winning goal against Crystal Palace in 2005 when we beat you 1-0. Now for me, I could have any shirt, but it's been signed by the player, letter of authenticity from the club, and that's great. What Liverpool are doing is that they are saying the blockchain is another method of giving that letter of authenticity. Are these tokens going to be worth money in the future? Well, history tells us that at least 90% of them are going to fall in value. Some might go up in value. So it's a lottery. And if you want to buy one of these tokens under those conditions, that's great. But when I buy a Euro Millions lottery ticket, I don't say I'm a trader in lottery tickets or I'm an investor in lottery tickets. I'm just saying, it's a couple of quid. I don't mind doing it. Some of it goes to good causes, and I know in almost true, sir, there's a 99% chance that I'm going to win absolutely nothing, and I buy it with that in mind. The issue with NFTs is there's a sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink mentality from some of the organisations which are involved in the sale of NFTs that, if you miss out on this, you're missing out on thousands. And you could say, well, isn't that exactly the same marketing campaign used by the National Lottery? Yeah. And it is, except I think people who buy lottery tickets have a better idea that they are probably going to lose.
Do you know what, Kieran? I'd remembered that Palace were bad in 2005, but not that we were that bad that the bloke from Heidi High scored the winning goal against us. When he was playing. Ted Bovis scored the winning goal against us. I think this is an interesting story, Kieran, because we know that Liverpool fans, especially those fans based on Merseyside, are very well-organised, politically savvy group of fans. And my guess is that those Liverpool fans won't be bending over backwards to buy these non-fungible tokens. But, of course, Liverpool have millions of fans around the world, so they are going to sell, aren't they?
Yeah. And I think if you take a look at Spirit of Shankly, who I've got a huge amount of admiration for preserving L4, preserving true Liverpool. They've said, if we see you trying to market these as investments, expect us to come down hard on you. So if you just try to say, look, they're digital cartoon cards, and if you want to go and spend $75 on them at your own risk, then fine. But as soon as we start to see any hint from any of the parties involved that this is an investment, we reserve our right to drop our we're not giving support, but we're not criticising it yet.
Yeah, good for them. Oldham's latest accounts show a tiny glimmer of good news for their fans at last.
Well, it is. Yes, I was talking to the Oldham Chronicle earlier today. I move in places, as you know. And Oldham, first of all, a little bit of care. The accounts are unaudited. We don't know how much money they made from the furlough, but it does appear that they've made a profit of around about £100,000. But at the same time, they are second from bottom of League Two.
Yeah.
And if relegated, the loss of TV money is the thick end of £1 million. So it's a big drop from League Two to the National League, and you've only got to look at the clubs in the National League to realise it's not a walk in the park to get back.
Yeah.
We talk about yo-yo clubs. Well, there aren't many yo-yo clubs as far as League Two and the National League are concerned. It's a tough division, and pretty demanding. And I used to live in Stockport, and I can remember Stockport being in the Championship. And they didn't just drop out of League Two; they dropped out of the National League. They ended up in National League North.
Yeah.
They got a new owner, and they're coming back, which is great. I mean, Edgeley Park is one of those places you love, because when I first went to university, it was Edgeley Park on a Friday night for football. And you then go and see a match on the Saturday as well, because in those days, even as a student, you could afford to do it because prices were geared towards the working youth.
And you could buy a ticket on the day, Kieran.
Indeed,
You could just turn up, queue up. That's another thing that young people don't understand these days. You don't actually have to get any points or go to a website. You just buy a ticket. Imagine that. It is slightly strange, Kieran, as we started off by talking about the fact that Premier League clubs are making vast amounts of money from being in the Premier League, but none of them are actually showing a profit, where you've got a club like Oldham, and albeit it's a small profit, but it is still a profit.
Well, yes, and I think part of the reason for that is, why are clubs in the Premier League losing in the money? Well, you've got 6 clubs chasing 4 positions for the Champions League, so therefore they gamble to make sure that they're in the top 4. You've probably got, at the start of the season, 7 or 8 clubs trying to avoid relegation to the Championship. So therefore, they spend more money than perhaps makes sense, because they don't want to go through the trap door, because there is a big financial consequence of being relegated. And then you've got probably half at least of the Championship at the start of the season thinking, we've got a fair chance of playoffs or direct promotion, so therefore we're going to gamble as well. So the system that we have at present encourages gambling, and in League Two it doesn't, because the difference in money between League Two and League One in terms of TV revenues is around about 400 grand. Not to be sniffed at, but you wouldn't gamble the house on it if you were a League Two club. And that's why we tend to see much more sense and much more of a break-even approach arising in some of the lower leagues, but not all of the clubs do that.
Yeah. It may be, of course, that Oldham are making money because they've been sensible enough to sell the tennis balls in their own club shop. Because if your fans are going to interrupt every second game by throwing tennis balls on the pitch, you might as well sell them to them.
Yes.
More players at Barcelona are facing a pay cut, and having just had that discussion, I can't imagine there'd be many Oldham fans now going, oh my God, that's terrible, my heart is breaking.
Yes, so this is Gerard Piqué, Sergio Busquets, Jordi Alba. I think they have. They're all. They're not young players necessarily. I think they're coming to the end of contracts, and in terms of renewals, it looks like they are going to have to take pay cuts, because according to Marca, which is the Spanish football newspaper, they're owed a total of over 100 million euros over the course of next season through a combination of salaries, delayed payments and bonuses. Right. And what the Barcelona board are trying to do is to pressurise them to give up some of that money. Now, we're not that far away from what we were talking about in terms of Robbie Keane earlier. Yeah. Nobody forces Barcelona to give these contracts to the players to begin with. And now what the club's trying to do is to emotionally blackmail and say, well, we can't afford to make any signings during the summer unless you start to make sacrifices. These players have played for Barcelona for many years. Many of them have long-term, and they're Barcelona fans themselves. So it's a strange form of pressure that's being put on the players by the board. And let's face it, it's the board that got Barcelona into this mess in the first place. Yeah. Who signed Griezmann for 100 million? Who signed Coutinho for 100 million? Who signed Dembele for 100 million? It was the board of Barcelona.
Yeah, having talked about good news for Oldham, Kieran, less so for Colchester and for Aldershot. Colchester losing £50,000 a week in the last financial year, and Aldershot £97,000 a week in theirs.
Yeah, for Colchester, Colchester again, a club. It doesn't. I've been to Colchester's ground as an away fan. It's a nice day out. But you wouldn't think that you've got a football club there that is spending enough money to be losing 50 grand a week. But it's not just that. If you take a look at the total losses, it's not just 50 grand a week for last season. The losses have been going on for years and years. And I think the total losses are the thick end of 30 million. And here you do ask yourself the question, what have they had to show for it in terms of 30 million quid going out of the club? So, that it's just the weird way of football. And you've got to question, what is the logic behind the decisions which are being made at board level? Surely, we've spoken to some other clubs who do take a more sustainable approach. Why not just say, this is our budget, we're going to stick for it, rather than taking such a risk? And again, it goes back to the fan-led review. There are too many clubs who are one owner or one ownership decision from oblivion. If the Colchester United owners got bored, and I'm hoping they don't, and there's no evidence that they will do, of course, then you have got a problem, because you've got these legacy costs which have to be recovered somehow. In terms of Aldershot, I think it was 97,000 for the year. I think for
the year. Beg your pardon.
Okay, yeah. So I think it was our script was a little wee bit ambiguous.
My script, yeah.
So non-league, another evidence of Aldershot, club that wants to get its way up. And sometimes you have to spend money to do so. We had this question on the Monday show with regards to Salford City. How did Salford City get out of non-league into League Two? It was an expensive business, and that's football. Yeah,
obviously there are a couple of Aldershot fans at our live show last week who I bonded with purely because both our teams play in red and blue. That's how simple it is at a football level. Colchester have got that rather nice new community stadium. How was that financed, Kieran?
It was financed by the owners. The owners are involved in property, I believe, and it is is it called the Western Home Stadium?
Yeah,
it's a cracking place, and the away fans go behind one of the goals as well, which is, as an away fan, that's where you want to be. Yeah. There's nothing worse than being stuck in a corner. Or sort of parallel to the penalty box. Behind the goal is that's where all the way. That should be mandatory. That should be part of the fan-led review recommendations. Proper football with gobbing off at the opposing goalkeeper.
Yeah, and jumpers for goalposts, Kieran. No, while we're at it, gobbing off at the goal. Do you know? It's that bizarre incident at Everton when the fan tied himself to the post.
Yes.
Not enough people remembered that Palace were on a pre-season tour in the 80s, and we were playing in Le Havre, and while the play was up the other end, some Palace fans tied the French goalkeeper to a goalpost with a Union Jack, which is totally wrong, but it's still one of the funniest photos. It's out there on the internet somewhere. It's one of the funniest photographs you'll ever see in your life. And of course, I disapprove wholeheartedly. One of the recurring themes, Kieran, on Price of Football has been, and we are asked this so many times, how much an injury can cost a club and a player in insurance. Well, has Howden, insurance brokers, just compiled a report detailing exactly that across the top 5 European leagues for the first half of this season. We thought it'd be a good idea to ask Divisional Director of Sport James Burrows exactly that question and all matters insurance related. This episode of The Price of Football is brought to you by Packed Coffee. Big coffee is bad coffee, full of underpaid farmers and low-quality, over-roasted beans, all of which just leaves a bad taste in the mouth. Packed is changing the coffee industry from the grounds up.
From paying a price that's more than fair to knowing farmers on a first-name basis, Packed builds long-term relationships that flourish, putting the needs of their partners first and providing coffee that's personal to their customers. With Packed, you'll get award-winning specialty coffee, freshly roasted to perfection for your order, and ground just moments before it's shipped. There's over 15 different coffees on the menu at any given time to choose from, including Great Taste 2020 and 2021 winners.
So, make a pact to make better coffee now. Price of Football listeners get a free V60 and filter kit when they first sign up to a Packed plan. Just go to packedcoffee.com. That's PACT coffee.com. And enter the code POF at the checkout to create your flexible coffee subscription and get that free brewing kit. Make a pact to make better coffee. Better for the farmer, better for the consumer, better for the planet. James, thank you for joining us. The cost of injuries to players is without doubt one of the things we're asked about the most by our listeners. But before we discuss that and your report, tell us a little bit about your background and about your company, which I believe is owned by employees. Is that unusual in the insurance industry?
I think it does make us reasonably unusual, Kevin. So we're 35% owned by employees, which means that we're extremely client focused. It sort of engenders a very entrepreneurial environment. And it also means that we're able to take a long-term outlook in terms of the results that we deliver for the clients first and foremost, and for our business as well. For me personally, I've been advising in football sort of clubs, leagues and associations for the last 15 years. I was very fortunate to come into insurance and then to find my way into the thing that I really love, which is football and professional sport.
And explain the distinction, because you're a broker, not an insurer. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're the broker. So we work on behalf of the client. So we do sort of three things for the client. We help them identify the risks that we face, and then we help them to structure an insurance program which addresses the risks that they face. And then we go to the insurance market and to insurers to place that program and obtain the best outcome for our clients in terms of both the cover and the price of that cover.
Right. Before we get into the detail of feeling the strain on the cost of injury in football this season, can I ask you a couple of the questions we do get asked most commonly? Because I want to make sure that we are answering them correctly. I'm sure Kieran is, but these are questions that to you will probably seem really obvious, but we get asked them so often that it's quite clear that our listeners are not really taking it in, which is something I understand fully, to be perfectly honest. Firstly, is insurance compulsory for professional footballers in the British game?
So personal accident insurance, so player personal accident insurance isn't compulsory. So either for the club to purchase that insurance to protect their interests, or for the individual player to purchase that insurance to protect their interests, that's not a compulsory purchase. The only element that's compulsory, in much the same way as it would be for the employee of any company, is that in the UK you must have employer's liability insurance, which protects the employer, so the club, for legal liability in the event of an act of negligence that results in injury or illness to one of your employees.
Right. And for those players that are insured at a Premier League club, for example, who pays the dividends and what would generally be covered?
So in terms of who pays the premium, it depends on who's taking out the cover. So you have a situation where clubs will look to protect their interest in the player, so the asset value of the player. So if we start with clubs, there are, very broadly speaking, three types of cover that a club can purchase. The first one is what's called catastrophic insurance, and in very simplistic terms, that's protecting the total asset value of the squad if you needed to start again. So if you lost the majority of your players to a catastrophic incident, so for example, the plane falls out the sky, the bus goes off the road, there's a terrorist atrocity, then notionally that policy then responds to help you start again from a starting from scratch scenario. It can also be structured in such a way that it doesn't have to be the total loss of the playing squad. It can protect against scenarios. So, for example, if players are car sharing, so if there's a car accident, depending on how the policy is structured, it can protect you against the loss of perhaps 2, 3, 4 players, for example.
Which happened at Derby County a couple of years back, didn't it? So
that's right, yeah. So exactly that sort of scenario, but a sort of, it would have to be a worse case scenario than that. So effectively, those players either sustaining an injury which meant they could never resume their career, or worst case scenario, being killed in an incident like that.
Right.
So sorry, it's a fairly grim place to start, isn't it? Let's
we have to start, as I asked you the question, and I think people at home would be interested to know that level of insurance even existed, because I certainly didn't. But this is why you're here, James.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the second area is I'm afraid none of the terminology is particularly catchy, but the second area is what's called permanent total disablement insurance and accidental death. So there, what you're doing is you're looking at the individual playing squad members, and you're saying, as a club, what do I need to insure in terms of asset value for the individual playing squad members if they sustain an injury, which means that they can't ever resume their professional career again, or worst case scenario, if they are killed in an accident, effectively.
Yeah. Is the third one more cheerful?
I guess it's relatively more cheerful. So the third one is very much around temporary injury and wage roll protection. So again, catchy title, temporary total disablement insurance. But effectively, what the club is seeking to do there is to protect against the exposure of paying a player's wages whilst they're injured for a temporary period of time. So you sign a new centre forward, he goes out and plays first time, and we've all seen this sort of scenario happen associated with our own clubs, haven't we? New signing gets injured sort of first time out, and then is absent for a period, say, of 6 months, then that type of cover effectively would respond to pay either a proportion of the salary or all of the salary for the period of time that player is absent from playing.
And what happens, I won't name him, but Palace had a player, a very promising young player that we bought, who got injured very early on. And then over the course of 2 seasons, every time he tried to come back, he got injured again. Presumably he becomes more and more difficult to insure then, does he?
Yes, potentially he does become sort of, or an individual player can be more challenging to insure depending on their injury history. So that's one of the variables that insurers will take into account, alongside the age of the player, which is the other sort of key variable when insurers are assessing the potential risk.
And can a player can presumably insure himself as well? If a high-profile England forward playing for a high-profile Premier League club, if the club takes insurance, the player can presumably take insurance out in case they miss out on commercial contracts, image rights, that sort of thing.
That's right. So the club will seek to protect their interests, and then individual players can purchase what's called career-ending injury insurance, or players' own benefit insurance are the two ways it's most commonly referred to. But in effect, what you're doing there as an individual player is you're insuring yourself against future loss of earnings should you sustain an injury, which means that you can't resume your professional career effectively. And that's an incredibly common form of cover. I mean, it would be pretty unusual now to find a player who isn't taking out that type of insurance in some way, shape or form.
I have to say, you really need to work on your euphemisms, don't you, in the insurance industry?
We do. We certainly, it needs to be a little bit more catchy, doesn't it, to appeal to the audience.
A last general question for you, James. How involved are insurers in the medical for a transferred player?
So medicals. I mean, it depends on the type of insurance that's being purchased, but they wouldn't necessarily be directly involved. If you take the scenario of sort of a Barcelona or a Real Madrid, when you've got the player going through the medical, which is probably for the man on the street, what we all see. But the same principle will apply to all players in the sense that if they are an insured player, then the club's medical staff are usually required to complete what's called a proposal medical, which is then sent to insurers and reviewed by insurers. But that's not unique to a newly acquired player. That's a process that clubs have to go through for all of the players that they're insuring effectively.
So let's get on to feeling the strain. It's a very comprehensive report, James, revealing the total cost of injury at mid-season. Is this something you do every mid-season, or is this just something you've done post-COVID?
So it was actually a project that we undertook for the first time in the 2020-2021 season. So last September we published a full report for that season, and I think it grabbed a lot of attention because it happened to sort of coincide with one of the most disrupted seasons that we've ever seen across Europe.
I've actually read it, which is unusual for me. Guy normally sends me the research, and I kind of read the first line and the last line because I don't do numbers very well. But I thought this is really, really interesting. The total cost of injury so far this season across all 5 major leagues in Europe was €279.49 million. So how does that compare with the season before?
So when we look at the season before, the first report we produced was for the entirety of the season before. So there isn't a midpoint comparison that we can take. But if we look at the total cost of injuries across the course of the 2020-21 season, then the total cost was 472 million. So you can derive from that we are very much on track to either hit or exceed that target, which makes it sound like a positive. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to sound like a positive, but certainly on track to exceed that figure, I would say.
And which league paid out most?
So the Premier League, the English Premier League, paid out most, or have paid out most, certainly up to January this season.
Do we know why?
I mean, the most obvious answer is that average salaries in the Premier League exceed those of the other four leagues around Europe. I'd say there are also some contributory factors around that as well. When you look at the first half of this season, and there are probably some mitigating circumstances. So if we look at the sort of the peak of the Omicron hit the UK and then had a downward impact in terms of the Premier League earlier than it would have done across the other European leagues. So a lot of those absences and potentially knock-on absences through injuries as a result of COVID absences, playing more games in a shortened period of time, would have been seen in sort of earlier in the Premier League than perhaps they would have been seen in the other leagues. The mid-season break for the English Premier League falls later than the other leagues as well. So our mid-season break wasn't until late January, early February, whereas for the other leagues, that would have kicked in late December in most instances. So that would have had a sort of negative impact from the Premier League perspective. And also, if you look at December specifically for the EPL, then the lack of a mid-season break in December also contrasts with what is the busiest time of year, as we all know, for the Premier League and for English football around that festive period.
Yeah, because I was really interested to read the bit about the Premier League was highest by some way for soft tissue injuries. Is that all for those reasons that you've just explained, that we're playing way more matches than other people, or because the matches were crammed into that Christmas period, or are there other reasons for that?
Yeah, I think that goes some way towards providing an explanation for why the Premier League was also leading the way in soft tissue injuries, and particularly in December. I think for us, what will be interesting to see is whether or not that impact sustained beyond sort of mid-January into February and March as well, which will be borne out in the full report at the end of the season.
Does all this mean, from an insurer's point of view, especially in terms of the soft tissue injuries and the amount of games that we play in England compared to other countries and the lack of break, does it mean, from an insurer's point of view, they would like to see fewer games and more substitutes so that insurers are tending to pay out less?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of the insurers. We're the broker, so our priority is to represent our clients in the process and help them to identify the risks, structure the program, and then place that program with insurers. For us, the intention of the report was very much to contribute to the debate and the conversation around things like five substitutes over the frequency of games that are being played, but also to work with clubs and with insurers to develop products that best suit their needs.
So you're constantly working then as a broker. You're working with clubs to find ways of finding them a better product as well, presumably, which is interesting because I think a lot of people listening to this, I think insurers for a lot of people have the same sort of reputation as agents do because people don't understand the insurance business. And I think most people still have this sort of old 60s and 70s carry-on film type view of insurers where they think they're basically in it to make money for themselves. So it's interesting to hear that you're working with clubs to find ways of making their life much easier, more streamlined, and saving them money where they can.
Yeah, from our perspective, our view as Howden is that the sort of the football industry, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, but has changed out of sight over the course of the last 25 to 30 years with the broadcasting money that's come into the game, the inflation of player salaries, the investment, particularly from an insurance perspective, the investment in medical facilities and how quickly players can recover from injury. So the direction that we'd like to take the conversation is that if things have changed that dramatically, then the products that support clubs and help them to mitigate the risks that they face really do need to catch up and address the exposures that clubs face, which over the course of the last 25 to 30 years have changed pretty significantly. If I were to sort of give a perspective on that, I would say that some of the insurance products that are out there perhaps haven't kept pace in the same way that the industry and the risks that the industry faces have evolved.
We talk about this report being about the five major leagues. We know that different countries have different legal systems. Do insurance systems vary in different countries, or is it pretty much the same industry wherever you are in the world?
They can vary. So if you look at Italy, for example, and Serie A was one of the leagues that we conducted the analysis for. So in Italy, for example, you will have sort of locally purchased or policies that have to be purchased locally in a certain way. So there are certain personal accident policies that have to be purchased for employees in that locality, and the same principle applies to players. I think one of the other interesting points to note is around player contracts. So you'll have scenarios in certain localities where players' contracts are guaranteed for the period of the contract, regardless of whether or not they're injured. And the Premier League is a good example of that. When you look at other leagues around Europe, the contracts are not structured in the same way. So players' contracts potentially don't respond after a period of time if they're injured for an extended period of time. So alongside sort of career-ending insurance, individual players, depending on what league they're playing in around the world, will also look to take out their own wage roll protection insurance to protect them at the point at which their contract will no longer respond to pay them if they're injured. So there are some sort of unique elements as you go around the various leagues around Europe.
This has been a really interesting interview, James, and I thank you very much for it. But what's something that's never occurred to me before when thinking about football and when thinking about the questions we get about insurance cover for players is that notion of recovery time for modern footballers being so much quicker than it has been in the past and how that affects insurance. Again, it's one of those things which is why it's interesting to talk to people like you with insight, and it's interesting to talk to agents with their insight, because for most of us as outsiders, we just don't know these days. So I found that really interesting, how that affects insurance. The fact that players are probably expected to recover from major injuries 3 months or 6 months quicker than they would have been 30 years ago, because not only are they fitter, but the medical equipment around the clubs is so much more efficient.
I think there's that point, and then I think the other really important point to note around the advances in medical care and medical science related to the treatment of players is that 25, 30 years ago, you would have seen a much higher prevalence of career-ending injuries and the types of injuries that would have finished a player's career. It's extraordinarily rare now to see an injury sustained on pitch, which results in the end or the premature end of a player's career. And I guess that goes back to the point I was making around evolving insurance products to meet the needs of clubs.
That's actually quite a positive note to end on, the fact that there are so few career-ending injuries now. But one question, which I will ask you because it crops up time and time again, it seems to really fascinate our listeners, is what happens, God forbid, to a player who decides his career has come to an end because of injury, is paid out insurance-wise, and then a year later, for whatever reason, is able to play football again and can take up a professional contract. Our listeners are fascinated by what would happen to that initial insurance payment, or whether indeed they would be allowed to come back and play football again.
That's quite a complicated. That's probably the answer to that is reasonably complicated, but in very simplistic terms, and there have been examples of this across other sports. So if you are medically determined to have had your career ended prematurely by injury and the policy that was in place to protect you have responded, if you then get a sort of second medical opinion and are able to return or resume your professional career, then I must stress that the sort of scenario will vary from case to case, but yes, ordinarily you would be required to return the settlement that you had received if you then go and resume your professional career at a later date.
And finally, James, do you think at some stage there will be compulsory insurance introduced into football?
It's a really interesting question. My personal view is that when you talk about player personal accident insurance, that I think it's unlikely. Particularly from a club perspective. Clubs are run as businesses and they make business decisions in much the same way as any other organization across any other industry in terms of what risks they're willing to accept and what risks they would like to offset or find solutions to protect against. And I don't think football clubs are any different, to be perfectly honest with you. They all have different ownership structures and they all have different perspectives in terms of how they evaluate and how they want to address the risks that they face. So I can't foresee a situation where related to clubs that becomes a compulsory purchase.
James, it's been really interesting to talk to you. If you told me 2 years ago that there was a scenario by which I'd be doing a football finance podcast and being fascinated by an interview with an insurance broker, I probably wouldn't have taken you seriously, but that's just exactly what's happened. So we really appreciate your time and thank you.
Thank you.
Kieran, that was a really interesting interview, and it is a really genuinely interesting report. But I still can't quite understand, Kieran, why some form of insurance isn't compulsory, even a low payment premium that at least provide some cover. It turns out that my cat is better insured than some footballers, Kieran. That seems wrong to me.
Yeah, but remember, your cat, you don't have to have insurance. And that's the argument that's put forward, that if you take a look at any business, it's a business decision whether to insure or not. And I think there might be a fear that if insurance was made compulsory, then would that be an opportunity to say, well, yeah, we've got a captive market, we can we can raise premiums. So, the fact that there are some clubs that aren't willing to do it, and they've made that decision. Is it because they're trying to force down the cost? Is it because they simply haven't looked at it in enough depth? It's difficult to say. But I've got to say that as far as I was concerned, it was a bit of an education for me listening to James. He's a man that certainly knows his insurance onions.
He certainly does. I don't know if you can insure onions, Kieran, but he certainly knows them. But again, as we said in the interview, it's like when we talk to agents, fans don't understand these things, and it's because we've never talked about them before. That's why I've got no idea about insurance. I'm sure we are insured, but they're decisions that are taken way above my pay grade in the day household, essentially. I imagine. I doubt if Ali might be scamming me. I don't know. Maybe she is creaming something off the top of those insurance premiums I fork out. I don't know. And talking of forking out, if you'd like to make a contribution to our Always Free to Air pod, then please go to patreon.com/priceoffootball. If you have any questions for our next questions pod or pods after that, email us on questions@priceoffootball.com. Before I hand you over to Mr. Kieran McGrath for his customary farewell, I will point out that at some stage in the merry old month of May, we will be going to Accrington for our second ever live Price of Football pod. And hopefully on Monday's podcast, we will be able to confirm that date. But it looks like it will be around the 15th of May. And we will be looking forward to that very much. Then hopefully we can tell you the dates of Peterborough, Plymouth, Jersey and Belfast. Fingers crossed.
Okay. Thank you. Well, as always, thanks for the feedback. It makes a difference to us. First of all, emotionally, we are emotional guys. There's no doubt about that. But also, if you do give us feedback using your app for which you use to download your podcasts, and you can give us a review, if you give us 5 stars, it certainly helps. And lots of you have done so. So thank you very much for that. It helps. It helps the algorithms which our overlords at Apple and Spotify use to grade the podcasts. And we do sometimes break into the top 30 for sports podcasts, which, given this is a fairly niche show, is well, we thank you, because it's not down to us, it's down to you. But you can write whatever you want about us, and we won't take it to heart. You could say you would rather have the show presented by the Cookie Monster and 50 Cent, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference to us, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference to the tables, according to producer Guy, and he's the person that we always take our advice from.
Well, it might have to be the Cookie Monster and 50%. 50%. That wasn't deliberate. Yes, because the pod next week was due to be hosted by Chris Rock and Will Smith, but apparently, I'm not entirely sure why, but Guy tells me that's not happening for some reason, so we can't have our week off. So 50%, that's terrible, isn't it? Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The Price of Football. The Price of Football.